My name is Claire. I am 32 years old and work as a cyber forensic expert. Last Christmas, my brother Julian brought his new girlfriend to our family dinner. He paraded her around our parents' living room before stopping in front of my chair. He smirked and introduced me to her by saying, "This is the failure of our family." My parents laughed. His girlfriend, a self-made chief executive officer, did not laugh. She just watched them for a moment. Then she smiled faintly and said, "Interesting, because you are fired." And just like that, the illusion of my brother's perfect life shattered. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever watched arrogant relatives orchestrate their own downfall. Growing up in a sprawling suburban estate outside Chicago, my parents, Thomas and Patricia, measured human worth by job titles and luxury vehicles. I spent my youth dissecting code and tracking data anomalies, while Julian received endless praise for his loud, superficial charm. Tonight was no different. The dining room smelled of expensive catered roast and fresh pine. Crystal wine glasses caught the ambient light of the stone fireplace. The heavy oak front door opened. Julian walked in wearing a tailored velvet blazer projecting the image of a wealthy executive. On his arm was Maya. Maya was a 36-year-old African-American woman who built a financial technology empire named Apex Financial from the ground up. She possessed a quiet, unyielding authority. She wore a simple emerald dress. She did not need to speak loudly to command the room. Julian craved that kind of power. He recently secured a vice president of sales position at her company, and he treated Maya less like a partner and more like a trophy to validate his own ego. Julian guided Maya into the dining room. Thomas and Patricia stood up, their faces glowing with manufactured delight. They fawned over Maya, eager to align themselves with her undeniable success. Julian soaked in their admiration. He grabbed a glass of wine and walked past the corner where I sat observing the network traffic on my tablet. He stopped gesturing toward me with his glass. "Maya," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "This is my little sister Claire. She sits in a dark room staring at screens all day, chasing digital ghosts. She is the failure of our family." Thomas let out a hearty chuckle. Patricia covered her mouth, giggling as she poured more wine. They always enjoyed watching Julian establish dominance. I did not react. I simply locked my tablet screen and looked up. Maya stopped walking. Her gaze drifted from Julian to my parents and then to me. She analyzed the dynamic in a fraction of a second. The polite conversational warmth vanished from her face. She set her untouched glass of wine down on the marble counter. The soft clink of the crystal echoed through the room. "You think staring at screens is a failure, Julian?" Maya asked, her voice steady, carrying a chilling resonance. Julian chuckled, assuming she was playing along with his joke. Maya tilted her head slightly. "That is interesting," she continued, "because the person who audits those screens just handed me an internal report about your division. You are fired, Julian." The laughter died in my parents' throats. The smug expression slid off my brother's face, leaving behind a mask of pure shock. He opened his mouth to speak, desperate to salvage his fabricated reality. Before a single word could escape, a harsh synthetic chime pierced the silence. It was his phone vibrating in his pocket. He pulled the device out with trembling fingers. The bright screen illuminated his pale face. The notification banner was unmistakable. It was an automated, high-priority margin call from a ruthless brokerage firm. The glowing text on his mobile device cast a harsh, pale light across Julian's face. A margin call is not a polite administrative request from a traditional banking institution. It is a financial guillotine. When a retail investor borrows heavy capital on margin to inflate their trading portfolio, they are playing a lethal game with leverage. If the market experiences a sudden downward correction, that leverage becomes a chain around their neck. The brokerage firm demands immediate liquid cash to cover the bleeding deficit. The stark notification on his screen offered no room for negotiation. It demanded an emergency deposit of $300,000 within 24 hours. Failure to comply meant the firm would initiate a forced liquidation of every asset attached to his name, followed by ruthless legal recovery protocols. Julian stared at the glowing numbers. The tailored velvet blazer he wore to project executive dominance suddenly looked like a cheap, ill-fitting costume. Maya did not wait for his explanation. She did not raise her voice, demand an apology, or create a theatrical scene in our parents' dining room. A seasoned chief executive officer knows that anger is a valuable currency you never spend on a depreciating asset. She simply turned her back on the wreckage. Her designer heels clicked a steady rhythmic cadence against the hardwood floor as she walked away from the catered dinner. Julian opened his mouth, raising a trembling hand to stop her, but his vocal cords paralyzed. He was trapped between the terrifying reality of his financial notification and the devastating public loss of his corporate status. Maya opened the heavy oak front door and stepped out into the freezing December air. The door clicked shut behind her, a sharp sound that sealed the quiet, suffocating dread inside the house. Thomas and Patricia stood frozen in the center of the room. The aroma of roasted meats and expensive wine soured in the tense atmosphere. Thomas set his crystal wine glass down on the marble counter with a heavy thud. The manufactured delight on his face dissolved into a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He demanded to know what just happened. He demanded to know why the wealthy woman his son intended to manipulate had just fired him and walked out into the snow. Julian could not look his father in the eyes. His hands shook so violently that his phone slipped from his grip, bouncing against the intricate pattern of the Persian rug. He sank into a dining chair, burying his face in his palms. The arrogant vice president of sales was gone. In his place sat a terrified, cornered boy, realizing his entire world was built on a crumbling foundation of illicit debt. Thomas stepped forward, his voice rising, demanding an answer. Julian choked on his own breath, the truth finally spilling from his lips in a pathetic, broken sequence. He confessed that his lucrative salary at Apex Financial was never enough to fund the illusion he desperately wanted to project. Julian craved the validation of the elite tier of society. He wanted to sit at high-stakes tables, drive European supercars, and prove to Maya that he was her financial equal rather than just an employee. To bridge the gap between his reality and his towering ambition, he turned to risky day trading. He borrowed heavy margins on volatile tech startups, betting everything on a rapid windfall. But the market is an unfeeling entity. It does not care about arrogance. The market corrected downward and his portfolio bled out in a matter of days. The real betrayal ran much deeper than a failed stock portfolio. Thomas pressed him harder, asking how Julian secured a credit line large enough to borrow that kind of capital in the first place. Julian kept his eyes fixed on the floorboards. He admitted that traditional banks refused his applications. His credit history lacked the collateral required for a six-figure leverage account. To bypass the strict regulations, he had to use a shadow lender. These unregulated private equity firms require hard, tangible collateral before they wire funds. Julian did not own any property, but his parents did. He confessed that he had accessed the physical safe in their home office a month ago. He extracted the original deed to their sprawling suburban estate. Using forged signatures and his corporate connections, he leveraged their primary residence to secure the hard money loan. If he did not produce the $300,000 by tomorrow, the shadow lender would initiate a hostile foreclosure on the very house we were standing in. The silence in the dining room became thick and oppressive. Any normal parent would react to this confession with profound outrage. A normal father would condemn the son who just gambled their entire life savings away to buy a sports car. A normal mother would collapse at the realization that her home was now collateral for a failed stock scheme. But Thomas and Patricia were not normal parents. They operated on a twisted hierarchy where Julian could do no wrong. Julian was their golden child, the chosen son meant to elevate their social status. The prospect of losing the house terrified them, but their toxic enabling instincts overrode their sense of self-preservation. They refused to accept that Julian was a criminal. They needed a scapegoat. They needed someone else to carry the blame for the disaster unfolding in their living room. Patricia turned her head slowly. Her eyes locked onto me. I was still sitting quietly in my corner chair, my tablet resting on my lap. I had watched the entire confession unfold with the detached calculation of a cyber forensic auditor. I did not offer any sympathy or gasp in shock because I always knew his unchecked greed would lead to a catastrophic failure. Patricia marched across the room, the heels of her shoes striking the floor with harsh force. Her face twisted with a misplaced, desperate fury. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. She blamed me. She accused me of ruining the evening with my quiet, sour attitude. She claimed that my lack of enthusiasm had poisoned the atmosphere and caused Maya to overreact to a simple misunderstanding. Her logic was entirely fractured, but desperate people will cling to any narrative that protects their fragile ego. Patricia ordered me to stand up. She commanded me to run out into the freezing driveway, find Maya, and apologize on behalf of the family. She demanded that I beg the chief executive officer to reinstate Julian to his executive position. In her mind, getting his salary back was the only logical way to appease the shadow lender and save their suburban estate. She yelled that it was my duty as the younger sister to fix my brother's mistakes and sacrifice my own dignity to preserve his reputation. While Patricia screamed, her shrill voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, my attention drifted. I tune out emotional noise the same way I filter out irrelevant background data during a system audit. As a cybersecurity professional, I am trained to ignore emotional distractions and focus strictly on the digital footprint. My eyes landed on the side table next to the leather sofa. Julian had left his silver tablet resting on the polished wood. The screen was facing upward, still illuminated and unlocked. I stood up. I did not argue with my mother. I did not defend myself against her ridiculous demands or point out the sheer insanity of her logic. I simply walked past her, ignoring her frantic pointing finger. I approached the side table. A new notification appeared on Julian's tablet screen. It did not come from a standard banking application or a common messaging platform. It was a secure encrypted drop channel. It was the exact kind of peer-to-peer communication protocol utilized exclusively by individuals operating in the digital black market. The background of the notification banner was pitch black and the text was a stark bright green. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. The message contained a single chilling question. Is the Apex client data ready for transfer? The words burned into my retinas. The puzzle pieces snapped into a terrifying, cohesive picture. The margin call was the catalyst, but Julian was already executing a devastating backup plan. He was not just a terrible investor. He was an active corporate traitor. To secure the $300,000 and save his own skin, he was leveraging his soon-to-be-revoked executive access at Apex Financial. He was downloading millions of confidential financial records belonging to Maya's company. He was preparing to sell her clients to the highest bidder on an anonymous dark network. My brother was orchestrating a catastrophic data breach that would not only destroy his own career, but would result in federal prison sentences and the total collapse of an entire financial technology empire. He was burning the world down to keep himself warm, and I was the only person in the room who knew how to extinguish the fire. I did not answer my mother. Patricia continued to scream, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of the dining room, demanding that I fix the disaster my brother created. I ignored her entirely. I picked up my wool coat from the hallway rack and slid my arms into the sleeves. I did not look back at Thomas pacing near the fireplace or at Julian sitting frozen in his chair. The heavy front door shut behind me, severing the frantic noise of my family. The cold December wind hit my face, sharp and sobering. Fresh snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked down the paved driveway toward my car. I climbed inside, started the engine, and turned the heater on high. My hands gripped the steering wheel, but my mind was already miles away, dissecting the glowing green text I had just seen on my brother's iPad. Is the Apex client data ready for transfer? The words repeated in my head like a warning siren. Julian was a vice president of sales. He possessed high-level clearance, but he lacked the technical intellect to understand the digital footprints he was leaving behind. I navigated the dark suburban roads, driving away from the sprawling estates and heading straight for the city. My apartment was a stark contrast to my parents' ostentatious home. It was a functional, quiet sanctuary located on the top floor of a secure high-rise. The space was dominated by my workstation. 3 curved monitors sat on a wide glass desk, accompanied by dual processing towers and a dedicated server rack humming softly in the corner. As a cyber forensic expert, my entire career revolved around hunting digital ghosts. I spent my days analyzing network intrusions, recovering encrypted ledgers, and identifying internal corporate threats. My brother had just become my primary target. I tossed my coat onto the sofa, sat in my ergonomic chair, and woke the workstation. The monitors flared to life, casting a pale blue glow across the dark room. I did not need physical access to Julian's devices to see what he was doing. I built the home network for my parents 5 years ago. I knew every router configuration, every firewall vulnerability, and every default gateway in that house. I opened a secure terminal window and initiated a remote handshake with their residential IP address. Julian was arrogant. He believed that downloading an anonymous messaging application onto his tablet made him a phantom. He did not realize that securing the application meant nothing if the underlying network traffic was exposed. I bypassed the basic residential security protocols within seconds. I gained administrative access to the main router sitting in my parents' living room and began running a deep packet inspection on the active data streams. The terminal screen filled with lines of raw code scrolling rapidly as my software captured and analyzed the outgoing traffic. I isolated the specific media access control address tied to Julian's laptop. He was sitting in the dining room connected to the local wireless network, pushing a heavy data load toward an external server. I intercepted the transmission protocol and began unpacking the payload. The sheer volume of the data transfer made my blood run cold. Julian was not just stealing a few client email addresses or internal sales memos. He had weaponized his executive credentials before Maya officially revoked his access in the human resources system. He initiated a bulk export from the primary Apex Financial Secure Vault. The files scrolling across my monitor contained the raw, unfiltered architecture of a financial technology empire. I opened a decrypted sample file. It was a structured database dump containing millions of individual customer records. I saw social security numbers, biometric identification, hashes linked bank routing sequences, and real-time investment portfolios. It was the digital equivalent of a gold mine, and Julian was dragging it out the back door. I traced the destination of the data stream. Julian was communicating with a proxy server located on a known dark web domain. I ran a cross-reference on the digital wallet address attached to the transmission. The puzzle assembled itself with terrifying clarity. The shadow lender demanding $300,000 by tomorrow morning. Julian had no liquid cash and no property to sell. To cover the margin call and save himself from violent retribution, he was auctioning off the identities of every single Apex Financial client to a syndicate of international identity thieves. He was trading millions of innocent lives for a quick cryptocurrency payout to cover his own gambling debts. If this transaction completed, the fallout would be apocalyptic. Apex Financial was a trusted institution. The moment the data hit the black market, federal regulators would freeze the company's operations. The Securities and Exchange Commission would launch a relentless investigation. Consumer trust would evaporate overnight, sending the company's stock plummeting into the ground. But the true victim of this breach would be Maya. As the chief executive officer, she bore the ultimate fiduciary responsibility for data security. Julian was not just stealing her clients, he was framing her for catastrophic negligence. If the federal authorities determined that her systems were compromised from the inside, Maya would face congressional hearings, the loss of her corporate license, and potentially a lengthy federal prison sentence. Julian was preparing to destroy the woman he claimed to love just to protect his own ego. I leaned closer to the monitors, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. I needed to map the exact route of the data transfer to understand how close he was to completing the sale. As I traced the relay nodes, a new horrifying variable emerged from the code. Julian was a salesman, not a network engineer. He understood the concept of hiding his identity, but his execution was fatally flawed. When a professional hacker moves stolen data, they bounce the signal through dozens of offshore servers to mask the origin point. Julian tried to utilize a virtual private network, but he misconfigured the primary routing protocol. He failed to mask the initial uplink. Instead of hiding the origin, he inadvertently hard-coded the host address directly into the payload header. I stared at the origin IP address blinking on my screen. It was not routed through a coffee shop or a public library. The data breach was anchored directly to the residential router in my parents' house. The legal implications of that error were staggering. When the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cyber Division detected the sale of the Apex database, they would not knock on Julian's luxury apartment door in the city. Their tracking algorithms would follow the digital breadcrumbs straight to the suburban estate. Federal agents would raid the property at dawn. They would seize the servers, the computers, and the physical house as evidence of a massive cybercrime ring. Thomas and Patricia would be dragged from their home in handcuffs. Under federal conspiracy laws, the owner of the network hosting the stolen data is treated as an active accomplice. My parents would be charged with harboring a cybercriminal, facilitating federal wire fraud, and violating national data security acts. Julian was not just using their house as collateral for a shadow loan. He was using his own mother and father as human shields against the FBI. I sat back in my chair, the ambient hum of the server rack filling the silence of my apartment. I held the undeniable proof of a federal crime in my hands. The data packets were logged, the IP addresses were verified. The motive was clearly established by the margin call. I possessed the power to sever the connection right now, to lock Julian out of the router and block the data transfer before it reached the dark web buyer. I picked up my phone from this glass desk. I needed to contact Maya immediately. She needed to lock down the Apex internal servers and initiate an emergency security audit before Julian could export another file. I unlocked the screen and opened my contact list, scrolling down to find her private number. I prepared to explain that the man she just fired was currently trying to orchestrate the downfall of her entire life's work. My thumb hovered over the call button. Before I could press the glass, a sudden shift in the ambient noise of my apartment broke my concentration. I keep a large flat-screen television mounted on the wall across from my workstation, permanently tuned to a prominent financial news network. I leave it on mute to monitor market trends while I work. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the standard stock ticker at the bottom of the screen suddenly vanish. The blue and white graphics of the regular broadcasting schedule transitioned into a stark, glaring red banner. The words "Breaking News" flashed across the top of the display. I lowered my phone, my eyes locking onto the television. The anchor sitting at the news desk possessed a grave, urgent expression. I reached for the remote control and unmuted the audio. The voice of the reporter filled my quiet apartment, discussing an explosive, unverified development regarding one of the most prominent financial technology firms in the country. The camera angle shifted, cutting away from the news anchor to display a live feed from a different studio. Sitting in a leather chair wearing the same tailored velvet blazer he wore to my parents' dining room just an hour ago was Julian. He was not hiding in the shadows. He was not cowering from the shadow lender or apologizing for his margin call. He was sitting under the bright studio lights of a national television broadcast, staring directly into the camera lens with a look of manufactured, righteous indignation. The banner beneath his face identified him as the former vice president of sales for Apex Financial. The phone in my hand vibrated, a cold, heavy sensation against my palm. The situation had just escalated beyond a quiet digital theft. Julian was cornered, and a cornered animal does not surrender. It attacks. Before I could warn Maya about the data breach, my brother opened his mouth on live television, ready to unleash a smear campaign that would set the entire financial sector on fire. The face of my brother dominated the television screen. The bright studio lighting erased the panicked sweat that had coated his forehead just an hour ago in our parents' dining room. Julian looked composed. He wore the tailored velvet blazer with casual elegance, projecting the aura of a weary, reluctant truth-teller. The financial news anchor sitting across from him leaned forward, treating Julian not as a recently fired employee, but as a brave whistleblower, risking his own career to expose corporate corruption. I turned up the volume on my remote control. The sound of Julian's smooth, practiced voice filled my apartment. He did not sound angry. A smart manipulator never acts out in rage when trying to destroy a reputation. He spoke with a quiet, calculated disappointment. He told the anchor that his time at Apex Financial was a nightmare of toxic leadership and erratic behavior. He painted Maya as a tyrant who ruled through intimidation and retaliatory tactics. He claimed she discriminated against any executive who dared to question her financial models, and that his sudden termination tonight was a direct result of him discovering systemic irregularities in the company ledgers. How was executing a preemptive strike? Julian knew the margin call and the shadow syndicate loan were going to ruin him. He knew Maya would likely initiate an internal security audit the moment she returned to her office. Before she could expose his theft, he decided to burn her public credibility to ashes. The anchor asked for proof. Julian reached into a sleek leather portfolio resting on the studio desk and withdrew a thick stack of printed documents. The broadcast cut to a full-screen graphic displaying high-resolution scans of the pages. I leaned closer to my monitors. As a cyber forensic expert, I recognized the structural formatting of Apex Financial internal reporting. I also recognized a digital forgery when I saw one. Julian had weaponized his sales access to download legitimate financial templates, but he had manually altered the data fields. He inflated the liability columns and deleted key revenue streams. He orchestrated a narrative that made Apex Financial look like a failing enterprise. He pointed to the doctored numbers on live television, solemnly declaring that Maya was defrauding her institutional investors to cover massive operational losses. The reaction of the financial market was instantaneous and brutal. The live stock ticker running across the bottom of the broadcast screen shifted from a steady white text to a glaring cautionary red. The letters APX appeared, followed by a downward-pointing arrow. The algorithmic trading bots that govern the modern stock market do not wait for federal investigations or audited truth. They react to negative sentiment in milliseconds. I watched the share price of Apex Financial halt stutter and then enter a terrifying freefall. 5% of the company's valuation evaporated, then 10%. Billions of dollars in market capitalization were wiped out while Julian sat in a comfortable studio chair pretending to be a savior. My workstation monitors lit up with secondary alerts. I opened a global social media tracking dashboard. The sentiment analysis meters spiked into the dark red zone. The viral backlash was spreading faster than a digital virus. Anonymous users, rival tech executives, and panicked retail investors flooded the internet with vitriolic attacks aimed directly at Maya. Trending topics demanded her immediate arrest. People who had praised her leadership yesterday were now calling for her total destruction. Julian had successfully weaponized the public against the woman who built the company. My phone vibrated on the glass desk. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I answered the call, keeping my eyes locked on the bleeding stock ticker. Patricia's voice came through the speaker, shrill and vibrating with sheer, unadulterated pride. "Are you watching the news, Claire?" she demanded, not waiting for my answer. "Did you see your brother on television?" She did not call to ask if I was safe. She did not call to discuss the terrifying confession Julian had made about forging the deed to their house. The reality of the shadow loan had already vanished from her mind, erased by the intoxicating thrill of seeing her son on a national broadcast. "He is brilliant," Patricia boasted, her words tripping over each other in her excitement. "He exposed that awful woman. Your father and I always knew she was treating him unfairly." I did not try to reason with her. You cannot reason with people who willingly choose the illusion. I ended the call without saying a single word and placed the phone face down on the desk. The television broadcast shifted again. The anchor interrupted Julian mid-sentence, pressing a finger to his earpiece. A breaking corporate wire had just crossed the news desk. The screen split in half, showing Julian's face on one side and a stark text-based press release on the other. In the corporate world, loyalty extends only as far as the profit margin. The board of directors at Apex Financial, terrified by the sudden freefall of their stock price, were executing a preemptive strike of their own. They were distancing themselves from the crisis. The anchor read the emergency statement aloud. The Apex board of directors officially distanced the company from Maya. They announced the immediate formation of an independent committee to investigate the allegations brought forward by their former vice president of sales. The final paragraph of the press release delivered a lethal ultimatum. The board mandated that Maya had exactly 48 hours to stabilize the stock price and provide irrefutable proof that the financial documents were forged. If she failed to clear her name within that narrow window, she would be permanently stripped of her executive authority and removed from the company she built. Julian had trapped her in an airtight box. By dumping the forged documents on live television, he forced Maya to spend the next 2 days fighting a public relations nightmare. While she scrambled to satisfy a furious board of directors, she would be far too distracted to notice the real crime happening in the background. She would not be looking at the server logs. She would not see the millions of customer records Julian was routing through my parents' house to the dark web. He engineered a perfect smokescreen. I looked at the chaotic data streams scrolling across my terminal window. Maya was bleeding out on the public stage. The board of directors had practically signed her death warrant. The public believed Julian was a hero, and my parents were blindly cheering for a son who was currently framing them for a federal crime. I reached for my phone again, navigating to my encrypted messaging application. I did not type out a long, emotional explanation or a generic apology for my family. In a crisis, brevity is the sharpest weapon. The encrypted file contained a single line of text: "I know where he is hiding the data." I routed the script through a decentralized node to ensure it bypassed the Apex Financial internal security filters, executing the final command with a firm press of the Enter key. The terminal verified the handshake. The message flashed onto Maya's screen, overriding her active applications. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and watched the system clock counting the seconds. A woman fighting for her professional life would not ignore a lifeline, no matter where it came from. Less than 2 minutes later, a secure reply populated my terminal. It did not contain a greeting. It simply provided an address located in the downtown financial district and a strict time frame: 30 minutes. I grabbed my wool coat, left my apartment, and navigated the icy city streets. The address belonged to a subterranean establishment hidden beneath an upscale steakhouse. It was a private invitation-only lounge favored by high-level executives who required absolute discretion. I bypassed the crowded main restaurant upstairs and walked down a narrow, dimly lit service corridor. A heavy steel door stood at the end of the hall, guarded by a solitary man in a dark suit. I gave him the name Maya provided. He nodded, stepping aside and pulling the heavy handle. The atmosphere inside the lounge was a masterclass in calculated silence. Acoustic paneling absorbed the ambient sound, reducing the clinking of crystal glasses and muted conversations to a soft, unintelligible hum. The air smelled of old leather and expensive bourbon. I walked past a row of secluded booths, my eyes scanning the low amber lighting until I found her. Maya sat in a corner booth, her back pressed against the dark mahogany paneling. She commanded the space effortlessly, but the glamorous socialite who walked into my parents' dining room was gone. She had discarded the emerald dress, replacing it with a sharp, structured charcoal trench coat that mirrored the armor of a general preparing for a brutal campaign. She held a lowball glass of neat whiskey, the amber liquid catching the faint light as she swirled it. Her expression was devoid of panic. She projected a cold, lethal focus. "You have my attention, Claire," Maya said as I slid into the leather seat opposite her. Her voice was quiet, lacking the performative warmth she used at the dinner table. "Explain the message." I did not waste her time with pleasantries. I laid out the tactical reality of the situation. I told her about the margin call that interrupted the dinner. I explained the Shadow Syndicate loan and the forged deed to my parents' house. Maya listened, her dark eyes tracking every word, processing the raw intelligence without interrupting. When I reached the technical details, the atmosphere at the table grew significantly colder. I detailed the encrypted drop channel I discovered on his tablet. I explained how Julian was currently utilizing his unrevoked sales credentials to download the raw architecture of the Apex Financial client database. The television interview was a calculated diversion, I stated, keeping my tone clinical and detached. He knew the shadow lender would break his legs if he did not produce $300,000 by tomorrow morning. He also knew you would likely audit his division the moment you returned to the office. He went on television and dumped those forged liability reports to put you on the defensive. He gave the board of directors a reason to tie your hands while you are busy fighting a public relations war and trying to save your stock price. He is packing up millions of your customer records to sell to an identity theft ring on the dark web. Maya stopped swirling her whiskey. She set the heavy glass down on the wooden table. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together in her mind. A seasoned chief executive officer understands leverage, and she realized instantly how dangerously exposed she was. If the client data hit the black market, the forged liability reports would be the least of her problems. The Securities and Exchange Commission would launch a federal probe. The board would not just fire her. They would offer her to the federal authorities as a scapegoat for the data breach. Julian was engineering a scenario where she would face a decade in a federal penitentiary for his crimes. "If I call the authorities right now," Maya reasoned, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "Julian will hear the sirens. He will wipe the hard drives, destroy the encryption keys, and play the victim. He will tell the board that I framed him to cover up the fake revenue losses he reported on television. The stock is already in free fall. My board gave me 48 hours to prove he is lying. If I send the police without a smoking gun, the board will vote me out by sunrise." She leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. She looked at me not as the sister of her enemy, but as a strategic asset. "You did not come here just to warn me, Claire. You have a vested interest in how this plays out. What is your angle?" I met her gaze, refusing to blink. "My parents are shallow, status-obsessed fools," I admitted, letting the bitter truth hang in the quiet air. "They spent my entire life worshiping a son who views them as disposable collateral. But they do not deserve to die in a federal prison. Julian made a fatal error in his routing protocol. He is pushing the stolen data through their residential router. He hard-coded their origin IP address into the payload header. When the cyber division traces the leak, they will raid the suburban house. My parents will be charged with harboring a cyber criminal and facilitating wire fraud. Julian will let them take the fall to save his own skin." We sat in the dim light of the speakeasy, the unspoken terms of our alliance crystallizing between us. We were two women fighting separate wars against the same enemy. Maya needed to catch Julian red-handed in the middle of the transaction to secure irrefutable proof of his sabotage. She needed a smoking gun to present to her board of directors. Something so undeniable it would instantly restore her reputation and send the stock price soaring. I needed to intercept the digital transaction, sever the connection to my parents' router, and ensure Julian faced the federal authorities alone without dragging innocent collateral damage into his sinking ship. "We need to build a trap," Maya stated, her tone decisive. "We need to lure him out of his defensive position and force him to execute the sale in an environment we control." "I will build the honeypot," I offered, outlining the strategy. "I am fluent in the digital black market. I will create a phantom identity on the dark web. I will pose as a representative for an international data syndicate. I will reach out to his encrypted drop channel and offer him a bounty for the Apex database that vastly exceeds his shadow loan debt. I will offer him $1 million in untraceable cryptocurrency. He is desperate, greedy, and arrogant. He will take the bait. Maya nodded, the strategy aligning perfectly with her corporate survival instincts. Once he initiates the transfer to your phantom buyer, I will have my internal security team trace the transaction. We will capture the definitive proof that he is the architect of the breach. We expose him. We recover the data before it propagates, and we hand him over to the federal authorities with a neat bow. I agreed, picking up my phone to prepare the necessary decryption tools. I accessed my secure server array remotely, ready to construct the fake buyer profile. But to make the illusion credible to a paranoid salesman, I needed to know exactly how Julian intended to receive the funds. He would not accept a direct transfer to his personal bank account, as that would trigger immediate laundering alerts. He needed a secure repository, a digital vault where he could hide the cryptocurrency until the shadow lender was paid. I ran a quick network probe tracing the financial destination routing code he attached to his initial dark web advertisement. The code resolved into a specific offshore registry. I looked at the glowing screen of my phone, the sterile green text populating the display detailing the exact financial vehicle Julian had established to receive the illicit funds. My blood ran cold, freezing the strategic momentum in my veins. Maya noticed the sudden shift in my posture. She watched my eyes narrow as I stared at the screen. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tight with renewed tension. "Did he change the routing protocol?" I set the phone down on the wooden table, the glowing screen illuminating the space between us. Julian was far more ruthless than I ever calculated. He was not just using my parents' home network as a shield. He had engineered a financial trap that would destroy them permanently. "He is not taking the money directly," I whispered, staring at the offshore banking details. "He is demanding the funds be transferred into a private trust located in the Cayman Islands. But he is not the legal beneficiary." I looked up at Maya, the terrifying reality of his betrayal sinking in. "He forged the trust documents," I said, my voice barely audible over the low hum of the speakeasy. "The legal owner of the offshore account receiving the stolen funds is Patricia. He is routing the dirty money directly into my mother's name." Maya stared at the glowing screen of my phone resting on the wooden table. The dim amber lighting of the speakeasy reflected in her dark eyes as she read the offshore registry details. A seasoned corporate leader navigates hostile takeovers and ruthless boardroom politics daily. But the sheer predatory calculation of my brother left her momentarily speechless. She reached for her whiskey, taking a slow, measured sip. "He is framing his own mother," Maya stated, her voice devoid of any inflection. "He is not just hiding the money. He is building a legal firewall out of his family." I nodded, keeping my gaze locked on the financial routing protocol. Julian was a sociopath disguised in a tailored blazer. He knew the margin call was a ticking clock. He knew the Shadow Syndicate would deploy violent measures if he failed to produce the funds. But his contingency plan was a masterpiece of cowardly self-preservation. He registered a shell corporation in Delaware months ago, layering it beneath a holding firm in Panama, and anchoring the final financial vehicle in a private trust in the Cayman Islands. The offshore trust was a digital fortress designed to receive illicit funds and launder them into clean, usable capital. But Julian did not put his own name on the beneficiary documents. He used Patricia. He stole her social security number, forged her signature, and utilized her maiden name as the primary security key. If the federal authorities uncover this, Maya continued, placing her glass back on the table, they will follow the blockchain ledger straight to that offshore account. They will find Patricia listed as the sole proprietor of a money laundering operation. And they will trace the origin of the data breach directly to her residential internet router. "Exactly," I confirmed. "Julian is using my mother and father as human shields. Under federal conspiracy statutes, owning the network that hosts stolen corporate data makes them active accomplices. They will be charged with harboring a cybercriminal and facilitating wire fraud. Julian will let them take the fall to save his own skin. We cannot let him complete the transfer from his current location." Maya said, her voice hardening with absolute resolve. "If the federal agencies trace the data burst to your parents' house, Patricia will remain innocent. It was a highly complex man-in-the-middle attack to execute it flawlessly. I needed physical proximity to his machine. I needed him off his secure home network. I needed him distracted, arrogant, and eager to complete the transaction in public." I looked at the digital calendar on my phone. Tomorrow was New Year's Eve. I am going to call him, I told Maya, sliding the Ultrabook back into my leather tote bag. I am going to play the role of the compliant, frightened younger sister. I am going to tell him I am terrified by his television interview and that I want to help him out of his financial crisis. I will invite the entire family to a high-end dinner tomorrow night to celebrate his upcoming media payout. Maya watched me, a faint, dangerous smile finally breaking through her cold exterior. You are going to bring him into a controlled environment. I am going to bring him to the Grand Crest Hotel, I confirmed. The rooftop restaurant caters to the elite. Julian will not be able to resist the optics of a luxury New Year's Eve dinner. He will bring his encrypted laptop believing he is untouchable. He will log into the VIP wireless network completely unaware that I am the one who designed the hotel's security infrastructure 3 years ago. The strategy was set. We were going to let Julian dress up in his velvet blazer, drink expensive champagne, and bask in the admiration of our shallow parents. We were going to let him believe he had outsmarted the financial sector, the shadow syndicate, and the federal government. And right at the stroke of midnight, we were going to drop the floor out from under him. I stepped out of the dimly lit speakeasy and walked into the freezing night air. The city streets were already vibrating with the restless energy of the approaching new year. I pulled my phone from the pocket of my wool coat and dialed my brother's number. I let the line ring 4 times. I needed those few seconds to slow my heart rate and modulate my vocal cords. To trap a narcissist, you must feed his ego. You must project the exact image of submission he craves. When Julian finally answered the call, his voice carried the sharp, impatient tone of a corporate titan fielding endless demands from his subordinates. I did not match his aggressive energy. I spoke softly, allowing a manufactured tremor to seep into my words. I told him I watched the television interview. I told him the sight of his public defiance frightened me. I spun a pathetic, yielding narrative claiming that our parents were right all along. I played the role of the bitter, irrelevant sister who finally recognized the superiority of her older sibling. To solidify the illusion, I offered a tangible sacrifice. I told Julian I wanted to help him navigate his transition between executive roles. I offered to hand over my primary savings passbook, claiming the funds could help cover his immediate legal fees against Maya. The bait was set, and the predator took it without hesitation. Julian let out a low, patronizing sigh, savoring the sound of my fabricated surrender. He accepted the financial tribute, instructing me to meet the family for dinner, to celebrate his forthcoming public vindication. He demanded we dine at the rooftop restaurant of the Grand Crest Hotel. He chose the venue for its elite optics. He needed a luxurious stage to perform his victory lap. I agreed instantly, promising to bring the bank documents. The Grand Crest is a towering monolith of steel and glass overlooking the frozen river. 3 years ago, the hotel management group hired my cybersecurity firm to audit their internal hospitality networks. I knew their digital infrastructure better than their own technical staff. And I knew they never purged the administrative backdoor protocols I installed during my audit. I arrived at the rooftop restaurant 2 hours before our dinner reservation. The dining room was a cathedral of manufactured prestige. Crystal chandeliers hung low over velvet booths, and panoramic glass windows offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the city skyline. I requested a secluded table in the far corner, creating a physical buffer between our gathering and the live jazz band playing near the bar. I sat down, placed my heavy leather tote bag on the floor, and extracted a modified micro router no larger than a deck of cards. I ordered a glass of sparkling water, resting my phone on the table to mask my hand movements. Using my old administrative credentials, I bypassed the hotel's firewall and spliced my rogue hardware directly into their VIP wireless network. In less than 10 minutes, I constructed the digital honeypot. I created a localized virtual sandbox. It was a flawless, mirrored replica of the global internet. Anyone connecting to this specific network node would believe they were browsing the open web, navigating to legitimate websites, and accessing secure financial portals. But the reality was a closed loop. Every single packet of data transmitted over that connection would route straight into the encrypted server resting in my purse. The digital snare was armed, invisible, and waiting for its target. They arrived exactly at 8 o'clock. The private elevator doors parted, and my family stepped onto the rooftop. Thomas and Patricia walked with their heads held high, wearing tailored evening clothes that projected their desperate need for societal validation. Julian walked between them, wearing a crisp charcoal suit, radiating the aura of a conquering hero. Under his right arm, he carried a sleek leather messenger bag. The rigid rectangular silhouette of his laptop pressed against the expensive leather. He was bringing the dark web transaction directly to the dinner table. Julian could not risk leaving the device in his apartment. The deadline for his shadow syndicate loan was expiring at dawn. He needed to execute the sale of the Apex Financial client database tonight, collect his illicit cryptocurrency, and launder the funds through Patricia's offshore trust before the sun came up. He walked toward my corner table with a confident, predatory stride. He did not look like a man staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. He looked like a king preparing to claim his permanent throne. The waiter arrived immediately, pouring vintage champagne into our crystal flutes. Thomas raised his glass, his face flushed with unearned pride. He delivered a lengthy fawning toast to Julian, praising his courage for standing up to a toxic chief executive on national television. Patricia echoed the sentiment, reaching across the white tablecloth to pat her son's hand. She wore a new pearl necklace, smiling brightly, oblivious to the terrifying reality that her name was currently listed as the primary beneficiary of a Cayman Islands money laundering registry. They toasted to his future, to his incoming media contracts. I raised my glass and took a slow, measured sip of my sparkling water. Beneath the white linen tablecloth, my phone vibrated in my lap. A steady, rhythmic pulse indicated that the localized virtual sandbox was functioning flawlessly. Julian had entered the lounge, opened his device, and logged back into the anonymous black market forum. I unlocked my phone screen, shielding the display from my parents. The custom interface of my rogue server populated the screen. I watched the live packet capture visualize the data flow. Julian was initiating the upload protocol. He was transferring the raw architecture of the Apex Financial Vault directly into the phantom buyer profile I created. The progress bar crept across my screen, representing millions of stolen customer identities, social security numbers, and banking hashes. He believed the data was traveling across international borders, bouncing through encrypted proxy servers. In reality, the entire financial payload was traveling less than 200 feet, dropping straight into the secure flash drive, resting inside my leather tote bag. The progress bar hit 100%. The transmission finalized. I had the raw data. I possessed the undeniable cryptographic proof that Julian was the sole architect of the corporate breach. Maya now had the exact weapon she needed to clear her name, restore the Apex stock price, and save her empire. But my mission was not over. Securing the data was only the first objective. The second objective was ensuring the dark web transaction never completed. Julian was staring at his screen in the business lounge, waiting for the phantom buyer to authorize the release of $1 million in untraceable cryptocurrency. He was waiting for the funds to hit the Cayman Islands Trust registered under my mother's name. He needed that money to pay off the ruthless shadow syndicate before sunrise. I did not send the cryptocurrency. I opened a secondary command terminal on my phone. Before arriving at the hotel, I engineered a highly specialized malware payload. It was a reverse ransomware script designed specifically to exploit the handshake protocol of the dark web forum Julian was using. When a seller finalizes a transaction on that specific black market, the system requires them to click a final confirmation button to release the escrow. I watched my server logs. Julian clicked the confirmation button. The moment his trackpad registered the command, my rogue server deployed the malware. The malicious code traveled back through the localized network, slipping past his outdated firewall and injecting directly into the core operating system of his encrypted laptop. Inside the silent executive lounge, Julian leaned back in his leather chair, waiting for the offshore deposit confirmation. Instead, the soft humming of his laptop's cooling fans suddenly escalated into a frantic, high-pitched mechanical whine. The processors overloaded. The bright display showing the black market forum flickered violently, colors distorting into jagged digital artifacts. Julian leaned forward, his brow furrowing in confusion. He tapped the trackpad, attempting to refresh the browser window. The cursor was frozen. He pressed the escape key repeatedly, his fingers hitting the plastic with rising urgency. The screen went pitch black. The sudden absence of light reflected his panicked face in the dark glass. A second later, the display flared back to life, but it did not show his desktop. The entire screen bled into a deep, aggressive crimson red. A pixelated, glowing skull materialized in the center of the monitor. The jaw of the digital skull moved in a silent, mocking loop. The ransomware did not just lock his screen. It executed a localized digital slaughter. The malware hunted down every financial credential stored on his hard drive. It scrambled the encryption keys to his personal cryptocurrency wallets, rendering his hidden funds permanently inaccessible. It intercepted the authentication tokens for his commercial banking applications, changing the passwords and locking him out of his own checking accounts. But the final strike was the most critical. The malware identified the secure access keys for the Cayman Islands Trust. It did not steal the keys, it burned them. The script overwrote the offshore authentication protocols with useless junk data. The digital pipeline to the Caribbean was severed forever. No funds could enter and no funds could leave. The money laundering firewall he built around Patricia was destroyed before it could ever be used. Beneath the glowing red skull, a single line of stark white text crawled across the screen. System locked. Data is being transmitted to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Julian stopped breathing. The oxygen evaporated from the quiet lounge. He stared at the word federal. The narcissistic illusion that shielded him from reality shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The shadow syndicate was coming for his parents' house at dawn. He had zero capital to pay them. His offshore contingency plan was burned. His laptop was a brick. And whoever engineered this attack was currently forwarding his physical location and his stolen corporate data directly to federal law enforcement. He did not try to reboot the machine. A cold, visceral terror hijacked his nervous system. His skin turned the color of old parchment. The tailored charcoal suit suddenly felt like a straitjacket. He slammed the aluminum lid shut, the sharp crack echoing in the empty room. He grabbed the ruined device, shoved it into his leather messenger bag, and ran toward the exit. Back at the corner table, the jazz band reached a soaring crescendo. Thomas and Patricia were laughing, sharing a dessert plate, entirely oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding down the hall. I sipped my water, slipping my phone back into my purse. The sandbox network was deactivated. The trap had sprung, and the prey was bleeding out. Julian stumbled back into the dining room. He did not walk with the confident stride of a conquering executive. His steps were erratic and uncoordinated. He bumped into a waiter carrying a tray of empty glasses, barely acknowledging the collision. Sweat beaded along his hairline, soaking into the crisp collar of his expensive shirt. He reached our table and dropped heavily into his chair, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. Thomas stopped laughing. He noticed the pale, sickly complexion of his golden son. Patricia set her dessert fork down, her maternal instincts finally detecting a genuine threat. She reached across the table, asking Julian if he was feeling ill. She asked if the venture capitalist from Tokyo had delivered bad news. Julian could not speak. His vocal cords were paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his ruin. He shook his head frantically, his eyes darting toward the elevator doors, expecting federal agents to storm the rooftop at any second. Before he could formulate a lie to pacify our parents, a tall man wearing a pristine black suit approached our corner table. It was not a waiter offering more champagne. It was the general manager of the Grand Crest Hotel. He carried a sleek leather folio under his arm, and his expression was entirely devoid of hospitality. The manager stopped next to Julian's chair. He did not offer a polite holiday greeting. In the luxury service industry, patience is a commodity reserved only for paying clients. And Julian had just crossed a dangerous financial threshold. The manager opened the leather folio and placed a printed invoice directly on the white tablecloth. He spoke in a low, firm tone, ensuring the surrounding tables could not hear the specifics, but the gravity of his voice was unmistakable. He informed Julian that the hotel accounting department was closing their annual ledger before midnight. He stated that Julian had an outstanding balance of $20,000 from a lavish private liquor tasting event he hosted in the hotel penthouse the previous week. Julian had thrown that party to impress Maya's rival tech executives, charging premium vintage champagne and rare spirits to his room tab, assuming his upcoming data sale would cover the exorbitant cost. The manager tapped the invoice with a manicured finger. He demanded an immediate valid form of payment to settle the debt. He warned Julian that the hotel security team was standing by, and failure to clear the balance right now would result in local police intervention for grand theft of services. Julian stared at the piece of paper. $20,000 was pocket change for the man he pretended to be. But the ransomware had just hard-locked his entire financial existence. Every debit card in his wallet was tethered to frozen accounts. His cryptocurrency was burned. He was a pauper sitting at a five-star table, trapped between a relentless hotel manager, a violent shadow syndicate, and an incoming federal raid. He reached a trembling hand toward his suit pocket, grasping for a wallet that held nothing but useless plastic. The general manager stood beside our table with the rigid, unforgiving posture of a man accustomed to dealing with difficult patrons. The wireless payment terminal in his hand caught the ambient light of the crystal chandeliers overhead. Julian fumbled with the leather folds of his expensive wallet. His fingers were slick with cold sweat. his motor skills degrading rapidly under the crushing weight of his panic. He extracted a premium titanium credit card, a status symbol issued only to high-net-worth individuals. He swiped the magnetic strip through the top of the terminal. The machine beeped instantly, declined. Maya had already revoked his human resources profile and severed his corporate credit lines the moment she walked out of our parents' house. Desperation hijacked his rational thought process. Julian pulled out a third card, a standard checking debit tied to his primary liquid assets. He thrust it into the machine. The terminal processed the request a second time. The same discordant beep echoed over the smooth jazz. The manager tilted the terminal screen so Julian could read the stark red text himself. Account frozen. Contact issuing institution immediately. Julian tore through the remaining slots in his wallet. He pulled out a dark blue corporate expense card issued by Apex Financial. He was holding a stack of useless plastic. The disturbance caught the attention of the surrounding patrons. At the adjacent Velvet booth, a prominent local real estate developer stopped swirling his scotch. His wife leaned in, whispering behind her manicured hand. The wealthy elite possess a primal instinctual aversion to public insolvency. They treat unpaid bills and frozen credit like a highly contagious disease. The elegant atmosphere of the New Year's Eve dinner soured rapidly. Hushed murmurs rippled across the dining room. The patrons stared at the sweating man in the charcoal suit. Julian felt the collective weight of their judgment bearing down on him, stripping away his carefully curated facade. "I need another form of payment right now," the manager stated his tone, dropping the polite veneer of hospitality. He took a deliberate step back and signaled to a broad-shouldered security guard stationed near the elevator bank. "If you cannot settle this $20,000 invoice, I will instruct my security team to detain you, and we will wait for the local authorities to arrive," Julian snapped. The polished exterior of the corporate visionary evaporated, revealing the terrified, cornered coward hiding underneath. He looked across the white linen tablecloth. His eyes darted wildly until they landed on Patricia. My mother had placed her designer leather clutch near her water glass. Julian lunged forward across the table. His sudden violent movement knocked over a crystal flute, sending expensive vintage champagne spilling across the pristine linen. He grabbed the clutch, his fingers digging into the soft leather. Patricia gasped, pulling her hands back in shock as drops of spilled champagne hit her silk blouse. "Julian, what are you doing?" she cried out, her voice pitching high with alarm. Thomas slammed his fist down on the table, demanding his son explain himself. Julian ignored his father entirely. He ripped the gold clasp of the clutch open, digging frantically through her cosmetics, tissues, and receipts. He found her primary credit card. It was the joint account she shared with Thomas, the account holding the liquid remnants of their retirement funds. Julian snatched the card and shoved it directly into the chest of the hotel manager. "Use this one." Julian panted, his eyes wide and manic, darting between the manager and the approaching security guard. "Charge the $20,000 to her name. Do it right now. Run the card." The manager accepted the plastic with visible disgust. He inserted the chip into the terminal. The entire table stared at the small digital screen. We waited for the authorization chime that would buy Julian a temporary reprieve. The machine processed the request. The red light flashed. The terminal emitted a harsh final beep. "Declined. Guarantor liability. Hold." The Shadow Syndicate had already moved on their collateral. Because Julian forged the signatures of Thomas and Patricia to secure his risky margin loan, the unregulated lenders executed an emergency cross-default protocol the moment Julian missed his preliminary warning deadline. The syndicate filed a digital lien against every asset tied to my parents' names. Their checking accounts, their savings, and their credit lines were frozen by a predatory debt collection algorithm. My parents were officially destitute, and they were discovering their financial ruin in the middle of a luxury rooftop restaurant. Julian stared at the red text on the terminal. His mind fractured under the pressure. The trap had closed from every conceivable direction. The federal agents were undoubtedly mobilizing to investigate the data breach. The Shadow Syndicate was coming to seize the suburban estate at dawn. The hotel was calling the police to arrest him for theft. He needed a scapegoat. He needed a human shield to absorb the devastating impact of his own greed. He pointed a trembling finger directly at his mother's face. "You did this!" Julian screamed, his voice tearing through the sophisticated quiet of the dining room. He abandoned all pretense of dignity, shrieking like a cornered rat. Dozens of wealthy diners turned their heads in sheer shock. "You and Dad pushed me into this lifestyle. You demanded I buy that European car to impress the neighbors. You wanted me to manipulate Maya so you could brag to your country club friends about my status. Patricia sat frozen, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The son she worshipped, the golden child she protected at my expense, was actively immolating her in public. Julian did not stop. He threw her directly into the line of federal fire, ensuring his own survival at the cost of her freedom. The Cayman Islands Trust is in your name, Julian yelled, making sure the real estate developer in the next booth heard every single word. The offshore accounts, the money laundering transfers. It is all registered to your social security number. When the Federal Bureau of Investigation raids our house tomorrow morning, you tell them it was your idea. You tell them you set up the laundering operation to hide the money. You are the sole beneficiary. Thomas stared at his son. The patriarch who spent 30 years measuring human worth by job titles and salary brackets watched his legacy crumble into ash. He realized his son was not a genius executive. Julian was a parasite who had just framed his own mother for international financial crimes to avoid paying a catering bill. The sheer stress of the revelation, combined with the loss of his entire life savings, hit Thomas with the force of a physical strike. The color drained from my father's face, replaced by a sickly ashen gray. He reached up with a trembling hand, clutching the fabric of his tailored shirt directly over his heart. He gasped for air, a wet, ragged sound escaping his throat as his chest tightened. He slumped backward into the plush dining chair, his eyes wide with pain and terror, paralyzed by the physiological toll of his ruin. Patricia let out a hollow, agonizing wail. She collapsed forward, burying her face in her hands, her new pearl necklace tangled in her fingers as she wept openly on the champagne-soaked tablecloth. The loving superior family facade was entirely eradicated, replaced by a public spectacle of raw betrayal and impending arrest. I remained in my seat, sipping the last drop of my sparkling water. I watched Julian pace near the table, breathing heavily, looking around the room for an exit route. He had sacrificed his parents to buy himself a few more minutes of freedom. Before the hotel security guard could place a heavy hand on Julian's shoulder, a distinct melodious chime echoed from the far end of the room. The private VIP elevator, a separate transport car, reserved strictly for dignitaries and executive buyouts, arrived at the rooftop. The heavy brass doors slid apart. The sudden blinding flash of a high-burst camera illuminated the dim corridor, capturing the attention of every patron in the restaurant. Maya stepped out onto the carpet. She was no longer wearing the protective trench coat from the underground speakeasy. She wore a razor-sharp tailored midnight blue suit that projected total unyielding dominance. She did not walk alone. Flanking her left side was the imposing chairman of the Apex Financial Board of Directors, a man whose presence alone could shift stock market valuations. On her right walked three individuals carrying thick leather briefcases representing the most feared corporate litigation firm in the city. The executioner had arrived to deliver the final verdict. The heavy brass doors of the private elevator slid shut, sealing the fate of the man trembling at our dinner table. Maya walked across the rooftop restaurant with a slow, measured stride that demanded total submission from the room. She wore a tailored midnight blue suit that acted as corporate armor. The ambient chatter of the wealthy diners faded into a tense, suffocating silence. The general manager of the hotel, recognizing the chairman of the Apex Financial Board of Directors walking beside Maya, wisely stepped backward, taking his unpaid invoice and his security guard with him. The elite ecosystem always yields to a higher apex predator. Julian scrambled to his feet, his chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. He wiped a hand across his sweaty forehead, leaving a dark streak of moisture near his hairline. His survival instincts misfired. Instead of retreating, he attempted to salvage his manufactured narrative. He puffed out his chest, trying to project the image of a courageous whistleblower who is being stalked by a vindictive former employer. He pointed a shaking finger at Maya and raised his voice, ensuring the surrounding tables could hear his performance. He accused her of crossing a legal line. He told the chairman that Maya was unstable, that she was tracking his personal movements, and that invading a private family holiday dinner was proof of her toxic leadership. He claimed this intimidation tactic proved everything he said on the television broadcast was true. Maya did not argue. She did not defend her mental state or respond to his frantic accusations. A commanding general does not debate a foot soldier who is already standing on a landmine. She reached into the leather briefcase held by one of her attorneys. She extracted a dense, heavy dossier bound in dark covers. She raised her arm and slammed the thick stack of papers down onto the center of our table. The heavy thud of the dossier hitting the glass shook the remaining silverware and silenced Julian instantly. The document resting on the champagne-soaked tablecloth was a digital forensic autopsy. Maya spoke, her voice carrying a cold, lethal resonance that echoed across the dining room. She informed Julian that the dossier contained a granular second-by-second breakdown of his entire digital footprint. She detailed the specific packet captures the encrypted transmission logs and the exact origin IP addresses linking his devices to the dark web transaction. She looked at Thomas, who was still clutching his chest in the velvet chair, and stated clearly that the network hosting the stolen corporate data belonged to the suburban estate of his parents. Julian stared at the thick binder. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. Maya turned her gaze toward the chairman of the board. The older man adjusted his expensive tie, looking at Julian with a mixture of profound disgust and legal calculation. Maya announced to the room that the board of directors had spent the last hour reviewing the forensic audit in a private suite downstairs. She declared that the independent committee verified every single page. The forged liability reports Julian broadcasted on national television were officially classified as an act of corporate sabotage and wire fraud. Every accusation against her leadership was dissolved. The board had already drafted a press release retracting their previous statement, and the after-hours trading market was currently stabilizing the Apex Financial stock price. She had won the public relations war before the new year even began. But Maya did not come to the rooftop restaurant just to clear her name. She came to execute a financial slaughter. Julian took a step backward, his legs shaking so badly he had to grip the edge of the table to remain standing. He stammered, offering a pathetic compromise. He told Maya that since she intercepted the data transfer, no real harm was done. He promised to sign a non-disclosure agreement and walk away quietly if she agreed to drop the criminal charges. He thought they were still negotiating. He lacked the intellect to understand that the negotiation ended the moment he went on television. Maya stepped aside, allowing the lead corporate litigator to step forward. The attorney was a tall, imposing figure with silver hair and a demeanor as warm as dry ice. He opened a thin black folder, bypassing the forensic audit entirely. He pulled out a single document bearing Julian's signature. It was the executive employment contract Julian signed when he accepted the vice president of sales position. The lawyer spoke with a sterile mechanical precision. He informed Julian that corporate espionage was indeed a criminal matter for the federal authorities, but Apex Financial was currently executing their civil remedies. He directed Julian's attention to a specific paragraph buried deep within the legal boilerplate of his contract. When Julian accepted the lucrative job, he was blinded by the signing bonus and the prestigious title. He never bothered to read the fine print. He never hired outside counsel to review the stipulations. He just signed the dotted line, eager to update his social media profiles. The lawyer read the provision aloud. It was a fiduciary reputational damage clause. The language was airtight and ruthless. It stipulated that if an executive engaged in malicious public defamation, forged internal financial documents, or caused a deliberate tangible loss of market capitalization through fraudulent public statements, the company possessed the unilateral right to seize their assets for immediate compensation. Julian watched the lawyer's lips move, his brain struggling to process the legal jargon. He asked what the clause meant in plain terms. Maya answered him. She leaned over the table, placing her hands flat on the glass, bringing her face inches from his sweaty forehead. It means we are taking everything, she stated, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper. The litigator confirmed her statement. He outlined the immediate financial execution to compensate for the billions of dollars in market valuation that Apex Financial lost during the televised smear campaign. The company was officially revoking his unvested preferred stock options. They were clawing back his signing bonus. They were seizing his executive pension contributions and canceling his severance package. The punishment did not end there. The lawyer explained that the value of his seized corporate benefits covered only a fraction of the total damages. According to the contract he signed, Julian was personally liable for the remaining deficit. He was officially slapped with a multi-million-dollar corporate judgment. Julian's legs finally gave out. He collapsed backward into his dining chair, his expensive charcoal suit bunching awkwardly around his waist. His breathing turned into short, rapid gasps. The mathematical reality of his existence settled over him like a suffocating blanket. How was a man who defined his entire worth by his perceived wealth? A few hours ago, he believed he was a millionaire tech visionary, holding the fate of a corporation in his hands. Now he was looking at a ledger that plunged into the dark abyss. The reverse ransomware had burned his hidden cryptocurrency. The Shadow Syndicate possessed the legal deed to his parents' house and had frozen his primary checking accounts. He could not even pay the $20,000 hotel tab for the champagne he drank last week. And now he owed Apex Financial a sum of money he could not earn in 10 lifetimes. He was not just broke, He was a financial ghost carrying a mountain of radioactive debt. Patricia continued to weep into her hands, the pearls around her neck covered in spilled wine. Thomas sat paralyzed in his chair, his eyes locked onto the black folder held by the litigator. The grand legacy of their family name was erased, replaced by a permanent corporate judgment and an incoming federal raid. Maya stood tall, buttoning her suit jacket. She looked down at the ruined man in the chair. She told Julian that the hotel manager was free to call the local police regarding the unpaid dinner invoice, but her legal team was submitting the forensic dossier directly to the federal authorities in the morning. She turned her back on him, preparing to walk away and return to her restored empire. Julian could not accept the finality of his destruction. His mind fractured, desperately searching for a loophole, a backdoor, any possible escape route from the steel trap closing around his throat. He looked around the silent dining room. The wealthy patrons were staring at him with undisguised contempt. His parents were broken, useless liabilities. Maya was untouchable. His frantic eyes darted across the table and finally landed on me. I was still sitting in my corner chair, sipping my water, watching the execution with a calm, analytical gaze. Julian saw his younger sister. He saw the quiet, obedient woman who fixed routers and stared at computer screens in the dark. He remembered the digital sandbox. He remembered the encrypted laptop in my bag. His broken logic seized upon a final, desperate delusion. He believed that if he could just destroy the digital evidence, he could force Maya to negotiate. Julian lunged across the table, his hand knocking a silver butter knife to the floor. He pointed his finger directly at my face, his eyes wide and unhinged. He ordered me to open my computer. He demanded that I use my technical skills to hack into the Apex financial servers right now. He told me to deploy a virus to wipe the forensic audit to delete the server logs before the federal authorities could see them. He yelled that I owed him my loyalty, that I had to save the family name, and that it was my duty to fix the network problem. The entire dining room held its collective breath. Maya stopped walking. She turned around, looking at Julian with a quiet, knowing expression, and then shifted her gaze to me. Julian leaned over the ruined dinner table, screaming at me to follow his commands, entirely blind to the fact that he was barking orders at the architect of his demise. He still thought I was a subservient pawn. He was about to learn that the pawn had already checkmated the king. Julian leaned over the ruined dinner table, his knuckles pressed hard against the glass surface. He barked orders at me, his voice cracking under the strain of his own desperation. He demanded that I open my laptop right now. He instructed me to hack into the Apex financial servers, bypass their administrative firewalls, and erase the forensic audit logs before the federal authorities could secure the physical drives. He spoke to me with the same condescending authority he had used his entire life. He still viewed me as a compliant tool, a naive subordinate existing only to serve his needs. He truly believed I was a quiet, isolated girl who would risk a decade in federal prison to save the brother who had mocked her existence. I did not reach for my heavy leather tote bag. I did not pull out my secure terminal or pretend to follow his frantic commands. Instead, I reached for a fresh crystal flute of vintage champagne resting near the center of the table. I picked it up, feeling the cold condensation against my skin. I brought the glass to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. The effervescence was sharp and cold. I swallowed, savoring the taste of the moment, and then set the flute down on the table. The sharp clink of the crystal echoed in the sudden quiet of our corner. I stood up. I smoothed the fabric of my tailored coat. I walked around the edge of the table, stepping past my father, who was still slumped in his chair, gasping for breath. I stepped past my mother, who was staring blankly at the wine stains on her silk blouse. I crossed the few feet of open floor and stopped. I stood shoulder to shoulder with Maya, facing my brother. The executives flanking the chief executive officer did not step in my way. The formidable corporate litigator stepped back, yielding the floor to me. Maya did not look at me with the disdain my family always showed. She looked at me with the mutual respect of a battlefield ally. Julian stopped shouting. His mouth hung open. His bloodshot eyes darted back and forth between Maya and me, his brain struggling to process the visual contradiction. The failure of the family was standing on the side of the executioners. The rooftop dining room was dead silent. The jazz band had stopped playing. The wealthy patrons sitting in the velvet booths leaned forward, holding their breath, watching the final act of this psychological dismantling. Did you really think the Apex security architecture experienced a spontaneous systemic failure just in time for your data extraction? I asked. My voice was level, projecting a calm surgical precision that carried effortlessly across the room. You believed you bypassed the encrypted vault of a prominent financial technology firm using a basic proxy server. You actually thought you were a digital genius, outsmarting a billion-dollar corporation. Julian swallowed hard, taking a hesitant step backward. You did not break into her vault. Julian. I continued, my eyes locking onto his terrified face. I left the back door open. I tracked every single packet of data you routed through the suburban router at the house. I monitored your dark web communications from the moment you received that margin call. He shook his head, a pathetic, involuntary twitch. He was trying to reject the words, but the cold logic of my statement was already tearing through his defensive delusions. The anonymous buyer offering you $1 million lifeline, I said, taking a single step closer to him. The foreign data syndicate ready to purchase millions of stolen identities and save you from the shadow lenders that was not an international criminal organization. That was a phantom profile I created for my apartment. Julian raised a trembling hand, pointing a finger at me, unable to form a coherent word. When you walked into the executive business lounge tonight, you did not connect to the global internet I revealed, dismantling his reality piece by piece. You logged into a localized, isolated virtual sandbox. I built a rogue network using a micro-server sitting right here in my purse. Every single file you attempted to export to the dark web routed directly into my encrypted flash drive. You handed me the exact cryptographic proof Maya needed to clear her name and restore her company. The truth hit him with physical force. His posture crumbled. The confident, arrogant salesman deteriorated into a hollow shell. He realized his master plan was nothing more than a scripted play, and I was the director holding all the strings. And that smart contract you demanded, I added, delivering the final fatal blow. The Cayman Islands trust you, registered under the name of our mother, the offshore account you plan to use to wash your stolen funds and frame your own family for international money laundering. I paused, letting the silence stretch, forcing him to hang on my next breath. The reverse ransomware payload that infected your machine 5 minutes ago, I stated, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. The malware that scrambled your cryptocurrency wallets, burned your offshore authentication keys, and severed your pipeline to the Caribbean, that code was written by the failure of our family. The unmasking was complete. The illusion was dead. Julian's brain short-circuited. He could not integrate the reality that the sister he despised had engineered his total destruction with flawless execution. His legs gave out. He stumbled backward, his leather shoes slipping on the polished hardwood floor. His heel caught the heavy wooden leg of his dining chair. He lost his balance entirely. He crashed backward, his arms flailing in the air. The heavy chair tipped over, slamming into the ground with a deafening, violent thud. Julian hit the floor hard, sprawling across the expensive carpet in his ruined charcoal suit. He lay there, staring up at the crystal chandeliers, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his defeat. He was outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and financially eradicated by the woman he told the world was irrelevant. At the table, Thomas and Patricia stopped their frantic gasping and weeping. They slowly raised their heads, looking past their fallen son to stare at me. The daughter they hid in the shadows, the child they ignored to elevate their golden boy, was standing before them as the architect of a federal takedown. They saw the cold, unyielding authority in my posture. The patriarchal hierarchy of the Montgomery family was permanently shattered. They realized far too late that they had worshipped a hollow parasite and alienated the only person capable of surviving a crisis. They were staring at a stranger, a formidable adversary they themselves had created through decades of neglect. Maya remained perfectly still beside me, her expression a mask of pristine satisfaction. The corporate litigators closed their briefcases. The execution was administered. The verdict was final. Julian was a beggar lying on the floor of a luxury restaurant, waiting for the shadow syndicate to collect his debts and the federal government to collect his freedom. But the night was not over. The calculated silence of the dining room was merely the calm before the final storm. Without warning, a piercing mechanical shriek shattered the atmosphere. It did not come from a phone or a dropped glass. It came from the ceiling. The hotel fire alarm system engaged. A deafening rhythmic siren wailed through the rooftop restaurant, echoing off the panoramic glass windows. High-intensity strobe lights embedded in the ceiling began to flash, casting harsh, erratic white light across the terrified faces of the wealthy patrons. Panic erupted instantly. Diners abandoned their vintage champagne and expensive meals, rushing toward the emergency exit stairwells. But I knew there was no fire. I knew the hotel environmental sensors had not detected any smoke. The alarm was not a safety measure. It was a tactical protocol. The Grand Crest security infrastructure was programmed to trigger the evacuation alarms and lock down the primary elevators only when a specific high-level threat required the immediate clearing of civilian bystanders. The federal authorities do not wait in the lobby. The heavy brass doors of the main guest elevators began to slide open one by one, revealing the true nature of the emergency. The final reckoning had arrived, and there was nowhere left for Julian to run. The deafening wail of the hotel fire alarm abruptly ceased. The sudden silence that fell over the rooftop restaurant was far heavier than the noise. The acoustic paneling absorbed the lingering echoes of the siren, leaving only the frantic, erratic pulsing of the white strobe lights embedded in the ceiling. The wealthy patrons who had rushed toward the emergency exits stopped in their tracks. They hovered near the stairwells, their expensive evening wear bathed in the harsh, flashing glare. The illusion of a physical fire dissipated, replaced by the terrifying realization that a much more precise and targeted emergency was unfolding in their exclusive sanctuary. The heavy brass doors of the primary guest elevator slid open with a smooth, mechanical hum. The individuals stepping onto the polished hardwood floor were not local firefighters responding to a triggered smoke detector. They did not wear heavy protective gear or carry oxygen tanks. They moved with a synchronized, predatory grace that commanded instant obedience. 3 men and 1 woman strode out of the elevator bank. They wore dark tactical windbreakers over crisp dress shirts. The bold yellow letters printed across their shoulders spelled out the acronym of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In the elite echelons of the financial district, the arrival of federal agents is a catastrophic event. It is a contagion that wealthy investors avoid at all costs. The local real estate developers and corporate executives standing near the bar immediately averted their eyes. They stepped backward, pressing themselves against the panoramic glass windows, desperate to clear a path and distance their own reputations from the incoming law enforcement raid. The federal agents did not glance at the frightened billionaires or the abandoned plates of caviar. They possessed a singular, unwavering focus. They bypassed the host stand, walking in a tight, disciplined formation directly toward the corner table where the Montgomery family was currently disintegrating. Maya stood her ground beside me. She signaled her corporate litigators to step back, offering the federal authorities an unobstructed perimeter. We had orchestrated the trap, and now we were stepping aside to let the justice system execute the final maneuver. Julian was still sprawling on the floor, his legs tangled in the legs of his overturned dining chair. The flashing strobe lights illuminated the stark terror etched into his pale face. He watched the dark windbreakers approach his chest, heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. He raised his hands in a frantic, trembling gesture of surrender. His mind, broken by the cascading failures of the night, anticipated immediate physical violence. He expected the agents to tackle him to the floor, force his face into the carpet, and bind his wrists in steel cuffs. But white-collar criminal takedowns are rarely physical. They are bureaucratic, methodical, and chillingly precise. The lead agent stopped 2 feet away from my brother. He was a tall man with a stern, weathered face and eyes that held no capacity for pity. He looked down at the ruined corporate executive shivering in the charcoal suit. The agent did not draw a weapon. He reached inside the inner pocket of his windbreaker and extracted a thick brown envelope. I tossed the manila envelope downward. It struck Julian squarely in the chest and slid off his jacket, landing on the floor next to his trembling hand. Julian Montgomery, the lead agent, stated, his voice a low baritone that cut cleanly through the tension of the dining room. You are hereby served with a federal subpoena. Julian stared at the brown envelope as if it were a live explosive device. He opened his mouth, stammering a weak defense, trying to claim he was the victim of a corporate setup. The agent ignored his pathetic protest. Federal investigators do not debate suspects in public venues. The agent outlined the specific parameters of the trap I had sprung. He explained that less than 10 minutes ago, the Automated Cryptocurrency Monitoring Division received an encrypted whistleblower packet. The federal algorithms processed the cryptographic proof instantly. They analyzed the data packet, verified the illicit transfer of the Apex Financial Vault, and matched the digital signatures to the devices registered under Julian's name. You are mandated to appear before a federal grand jury this week. The agent continued, delivering the words with the mechanical rhythm of a descending guillotine. You are facing formal multi-count indictments for economic espionage, aggravated identity theft, and interstate wire fraud. Your passport is flagged in the global database. Your physical movements are legally restricted to this judicial district. Any attempt to flee will result in an immediate fugitive warrant. The weight of the legal mandate crushed whatever remaining defiance Julian possessed. He curled his fingers around the edge of the brown envelope, realizing his pristine, luxurious life was over. He was no longer a wealthy tech visionary driving European sports cars. He was a federal target, stripped of his corporate titles, drained of his finances, and bound for a sterile courtroom where his arrogant charm would hold zero currency. But the federal execution was only half complete. Julian was not the only person at the table who had enabled this disaster. A second agent, a woman with sharp features and a clipboard tucked under her arm, stepped around the fallen chair. She did not look at Julian. She focused her attention entirely on the velvet booth where my parents were sitting. Thomas and Patricia were frozen in a state of catatonic shock. They watched their golden son receive a federal subpoena, believing their role in this nightmare was merely as horrified spectators. They assumed their parental status granted them immunity from the fallout. They were tragically mistaken. The female agent stopped in front of the champagne-soaked tablecloth. She looked directly at my father. "Are you Thomas and Patricia Montgomery?" she asked, though her tone indicated she already knew the answer. Thomas swallowed hard, his hand still clutching his chest. "Yes," he whispered, his voice weak and fractured. "But we have nothing to do with his business. We do not understand the technology. We are just his parents." Ignorance is not a valid defense in the eyes of the federal government. The agent pulled a red-bordered folder from her clipboard. She dropped it onto the glass table right next to Patricia's ruined designer clutch. "This is an emergency notice of asset forfeiture," the agent announced, sealing the doom of the Montgomery legacy. Patricia gasped, recoiling from the red folder as if it were burning hot. She shook her head frantically, tears ruining her expensive cosmetics. "What does that mean?" she cried out. "We did not steal anything." The agent maintained a cold professional detachment. She explained the lethal consequences of Julian's sloppy digital hygiene. She detailed how the origin IP address for the dark web data transfer was hard-coded to their residential internet router. Furthermore, she cited the fraudulent shadow syndicate loan Julian used to leverage their sprawling suburban estate, because your primary residence was utilized as a hosting node to facilitate a severe breach of national data security. "The property is now classified as an active instrument of cybercrime," the agent stated, outlining the brutal reality of federal conspiracy laws. "As of midnight, your estate is sealed. Federal marshals have already placed padlocks on your front doors. Your property is seized pending a full forensic audit." Thomas let out a hollow groan, sinking lower into the velvet booth. The grand colonial home he used to measure his superiority over his neighbors was gone. The fortress of privilege he guarded so fiercely had been conquered by his own son. The devastation extended beyond the real estate. The agent delivered the final crippling blow. She informed them that due to the complex web of forged signatures and the attempted establishment of a Cayman Islands money laundering trust, the government had initiated a global freeze on their identities. Every retirement account, every stock portfolio, and every mutual fund bearing their names was locked down to prevent the dissipation of illicit funds. "You cannot return to your house tonight," the agent concluded her words, stripping away the last shreds of their elite existence. "You cannot access your banking institutions. You are instructed to retain legal counsel immediately and present yourselves at the federal building tomorrow morning for preliminary questioning regarding your involvement in this conspiracy." The federal agents stepped back, their mission accomplished. They did not need to place anyone in handcuffs tonight. The financial and legal restraints they just applied were far tighter than any steel chains. The wealthy diners watching from the periphery began to turn away, resuming their hushed conversations, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive family. Maya offered me a brief, respectful nod before turning her back on the wreckage. She walked toward the elevator with her legal team, her empire secure, her reputation restored. I stood alone near the corner table. The flashing strobe lights finally ceased, returning the rooftop restaurant to its dim, ambient amber glow. I looked down at the three people who had spent my entire life telling me I was a failure. Julian remained on the floor, clutching the federal subpoena to his chest, weeping silently. Thomas stared at the red forfeiture folder, his breathing shallow, his face buried in his hands. Patricia sat shivering in her wine-stained silk blouse, her designer pearls offering no comfort against the crushing weight of her sudden poverty. They had spent decades worshiping a fraudulent image of success. They sacrificed my well-being, dismissed my intellect, and tolerated emotional abuse just to maintain their toxic social standing. Now the illusion was obliterated. They had zero assets, zero shelter, and zero power. Patricia slowly lifted her head. Her mascara was smeared down her cheeks, her eyes wide with a raw, unfamiliar terror. She looked past the federal agents. She looked past her ruined son. Her desperate gaze locked onto me, the only person in the room who possessed the capital, the intellect and the freedom to save them from the dark abyss they had just fallen into. The federal agents took a synchronized step backward, their heavy tactical boots shifting against the polished hardwood floor. They did not leave the dining room. They established a quiet, imposing perimeter near the elevator bank, their presence serving as a lethal reminder that the grace period for compliance was rapidly expiring. The red asset forfeiture folder lay on the glass table, a vibrant stain against the spilled champagne and ruined dinner plates. Thomas and Patricia stared at the official seal stamped across the cover. The reality of their new existence began to penetrate their profound state of shock. For 3 decades, my parents constructed their identities around the perception of elite wealth. They hosted lavish charity galas, maintained exclusive country club memberships, and drove imported vehicles they could barely afford. They funded this illusion by leveraging their assets to the breaking point, always trusting that their golden son would eventually secure a massive corporate windfall to keep their fragile ecosystem afloat. Now that ecosystem was eradicated, the federal government had seized their grand suburban estate. Their bank accounts were frozen. They possessed no liquid cash to book a hotel room, no credit to rent a car, and no collateral to secure a loan. They were facing imminent homelessness coupled with the terrifying prospect of a federal indictment for international money laundering. Patricia looked down at her hands. The diamond rings sparkling on her fingers were no longer symbols of status. They were potential evidence in a cybercrime investigation. She looked at Julian, who remained crumpled on the floor, weeping into the carpet, entirely incapable of offering a solution. The matriarch, who had spent the entire evening looking down on my career, suddenly realized her golden child was a terminal liability. Panic, raw and unfiltered, hijacked her nervous system. Patricia scrambled out of the velvet booth. Her expensive designer heels slipped on the champagne-soaked floor, causing her to stumble forward. She abandoned all pretense of high society etiquette. She did not care that the prominent real estate developer in the next booth was watching her with morbid fascination. She crossed the short distance separating us and threw herself toward me. She reached out with trembling hands, her fingers grasping the sleeves of my tailored coat. Her grip was desperate, her nails digging into the heavy wool fabric. She looked up at me, her face a ruined canvas of smeared cosmetics and unfiltered terror. "Claire, you have to fix this." Patricia cried, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch that echoed across the quiet restaurant. "You know, Maya, you built the security system. You have to talk to her right now. Tell her to drop the lawsuit. Tell her we will apologize. You have to use your money to hire a defense attorney for your brother." Thomas pulled himself out of the booth, his movements slow and agonizing. His skin retained a sickly gray hue, his breath whistling through his teeth. The proud patriarch dragged his feet across the floor, standing beside his weeping wife. He did not issue a command. He offered a pathetic, broken plea. He begged me to transfer funds to a legal retainer, claiming that we had to protect the family name at all costs. They were standing in the wreckage of a federal raid, facing their own imminent arrests, and their default instinct was still to sacrifice my resources to save the son who had just framed them. I looked down at the manicured hands gripping my coat. I felt no warmth, no obligation, and no residual guilt. The emotional manipulation that governed my childhood held zero power in this room. I reached down and placed my fingers over my mother's wrists. I applied a slow mechanical pressure, peeling her hands away from my clothing. I took a deliberate step backward, establishing a cold physical boundary between my secure reality and their catastrophic failure. "Maya cannot drop a federal indictment," I stated, my voice projecting a sterile surgical calm. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not negotiate with corporate executives, and they do not care about your apologies. Julian orchestrated a data breach across state lines. He is a target of the United States government." I looked at Thomas, watching his hollow eyes dart back and forth. "And my money will not be used to fund a criminal defense for a traitor." I continued, enunciating every syllable with lethal precision. "Julian made his choice. He forged your signatures. He used your residential router to shield his identity. He registered a Cayman Islands trust in Patricia's name to launder his stolen cryptocurrency. He threw you to the wolves to save himself." Patricia shook her head, frantically refusing to accept the depth of his betrayal. "But we have nowhere to go," she sobbed, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "The agents locked the house. The cards are frozen. We have nothing left, Claire. You cannot leave us here." I did not come to this dinner unprepared. I knew the deployment of the reverse ransomware would trigger a cascading financial collapse. I knew the Shadow Syndicate and the federal authorities would simultaneously converge on their assets. I anticipated their desperation. I reached into my heavy leather tote bag and bypassed the encrypted microserver. I extracted a crisp, thick manila folder and held it out in the dim light of the dining room. I did not offer them a comforting embrace. I offered them a lifeline constructed of unyielding steel. "If you want to avoid wearing federal handcuffs tomorrow morning, you will listen to my exact instructions," I declared. Patricia stopped crying. Thomas straightened his posture, hanging onto my words as if I were holding an oxygen mask. I opened the folder and extracted a dense legal document bound with a silver clip. It was not a checkbook or a temporary loan agreement. It was an irrevocable asset transfer and a comprehensive durable power of attorney contract. You are currently prime suspects in an international money laundering conspiracy, I explained, presenting the document to my parents. The only way to prove you are victims of identity theft rather than active co-conspirators is to demonstrate total financial transparency. You need a forensic conservator to untangle your remaining clean assets from Julian's toxic debt. I placed the contract on the edge of the glass table right next to the red federal forfeiture notice. I withdrew a heavy silver fountain pen from my coat pocket and set it on top of the paper. If you sign this document, I said, outlining the brutal terms of their surrender, you legally transfer full executive control of your lives to me. Every remaining retirement account, every physical asset not yet seized by the syndicate, and every legal decision regarding your estate will be placed into an independent trust that I exclusively manage. I will retain a federal defense attorney for you, not for him. I will cooperate with the authorities to prove Julian forged your signatures. Patricia stared at the legal text, her eyes scanning the dense paragraphs. The realization of what I was demanding hit her with devastating force. You want to take everything, she whispered, looking at me with a mixture of horror and sudden clarity. I am building a firewall to keep you out of a penitentiary, I corrected her, my tone devoid of sympathy. But protection requires total submission. From this moment forward, I dictate your finances. There will be no country club memberships. There will be no luxury car leases. You will live in a modest apartment chosen by me. You will receive a strict monthly allowance for groceries and utilities. I paused, letting my gaze drift down to Julian, who was watching the exchange from the floor, his eyes wide with rising panic. And most importantly, I delivered the final, non-negotiable ultimatum: not a single penny of the trust will ever be routed to him. You will not fund his commissary account. You will not pay for his appeals. You will legally disown his financial existence. If you attempt to funnel money to him, the trust dissolves, and I will hand your files directly back to the prosecution. The silence in the room became profound. Patricia looked at the silver fountain pen resting on the contract. Signing that paper meant the psychological death of her socialite persona. It meant relinquishing the patriarchal authority Thomas had wielded like a weapon for decades. It meant accepting that they were dependents living under the strict rule of the daughter they had relentlessly marginalized. Julian pushed himself up onto his elbows. His custom suit was wrinkled and covered in dust from the floor. Mom, do not sign it, he pleaded, his voice a pathetic, broken rasp. She is trying to steal your independence. We can fight this. I can call my contacts. We can hire our own lawyers. Patricia looked down at her golden son. She saw the sweat ruining his collar. She saw the terror in his eyes. For 30 years, she had given him everything he asked for. She had funded his arrogance, covered his mistakes, and validated his worst instincts. She listened to his hollow promise of calling his contacts, knowing full well he had just tried to frame her for a federal felony. She shifted her gaze away from Julian and looked toward the elevator bank. The federal agents were still standing there, their dark windbreakers blending into the shadows, their eyes watching the exchange with cold, calculating patience. The threat of a concrete cell and a steel toilet outweighed her maternal loyalty. Self-preservation finally eclipsed her delusion. Patricia reached out with a trembling hand. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal of the fountain pen. She picked it up. She did not look at Julian again. She bent over the glass table, her tears splashing onto the pristine white paper, and signed her name on the dotted line. Thomas did not hesitate. His pride was entirely broken. He took the pen from his weeping wife and scrawled his signature next to hers, surrendering his legacy in a matter of seconds. I picked up the contract, verifying the signatures, and slid the document back into the manila folder. The transfer of power was absolute. I owned their financial identity. Julian was officially isolated, cut off from the final remaining source of capital he thought he could manipulate. Mom, Julian whispered, his voice cracking, entirely unable to process the magnitude of his abandonment. Patricia turned her back to him, staring blankly out the panoramic window at the dark city skyline. She offered no comfort and no apology. I placed the folder into my leather tote bag and zipped it shut. The federal agents near the elevator gave a brief nod, acknowledging that the secondary targets were now legally secured under my conservatorship. The board was cleared, the corporate judgment was filed, the federal subpoena was served, the familial firewall was erected. As I prepared to walk away and leave my brother to his fate, a sharp, dissonant sound pierced the heavy silence of our corner. It was a generic synthetic ringtone. It did not come from my phone, nor did it come from the devices belonging to my parents. The sound emanated from the pocket of Julian's ruined charcoal suit jacket. The reverse ransomware had bricked his encrypted laptop and frozen his digital banking applications, but it could not disable the incoming cellular network of a standard mobile device. Julian flinched as the phone vibrated against his chest. He pulled the device out with shaking fingers. The screen illuminated, casting a pale glow across his terrified face. The caller identification did not display a name or a known number. The screen simply read, "Unknown caller." It was not the federal government. Law enforcement agents do not call a suspect when they are already standing in the same room. It was not Maya, and it was not a concerned friend. The midnight deadline for the margin call had officially expired. The $300,000 was missing. The unregulated shadow syndicate, the ruthless individuals who held the forged deed to the seized suburban estate, were calling to collect their debt. And they did not use subpoenas to enforce their contracts. The vibration of the device against his chest was a death knell. Julian stared at the glowing screen of his mobile phone. The stark text displaying an unknown caller cast a pale, sickly light over his terrified features. He knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. The midnight deadline for his margin call had passed. The $300,000 deficit remained unpaid. Ignoring a call from a commercial banking institution results in a late fee. Ignoring a call from an unregulated shadow syndicate results in a physical extraction team showing up at your front door. Julian swiped the green icon with a trembling thumb. His motor skills were deteriorating so rapidly that he accidentally engaged the external speaker setting. He brought the device up to his ear, but the volume was loud enough to project the audio into the quiet, stagnant air of our corner table. The voice that emerged from the digital speaker did not belong to an angry debt collector. It did not yell or issue cartoonish threats. It was a low, gravelly baritone stripped of all human empathy, operating on the cold mechanics of underworld finance. Julian, the voice, stated the name, dropping like a heavy stone into the silent dining room. Our automated registry just received a hard bounce back on the primary collateral lien. We see the federal freeze order on your parents' suburban estate. The property is compromised. The syndicate possessed algorithmic tracking software that rivaled the federal government. They monitored public databases, court filings, and real estate ledgers in real time. They knew the FBI had seized the house before Julian even had a chance to formulate a lie. Julian opened his mouth, a pathetic squeak escaping his throat as he tried to beg for an extension. The voice cut him off with effortless authority. "The forged deed is now useless to us," the caller continued, the steady cadence of his words slicing through the ambient hum of the rooftop restaurant. "Your digital accounts are hard-locked. You owe this firm $300,000, and we require immediate liquid compensation. We do not hire civil litigators. We do not file grievances in court. We repossess." Thomas and Patricia sat frozen in the velvet booth, listening to the voice of the predator their son had invited into their lives. The reality of the shadow loan was no longer an abstract concept. It was a tangible, lethal threat echoing across their dinner table. "You have exactly 2 hours to deliver the keys and the title of your European sports car to the warehouse on the industrial waterfront," the caller instructed, laying out the non-negotiable terms of survival. "Bring the designer watches. Bring any tangible luxury goods registered in your name. If the total value fails to satisfy the margin deficit, or if you attempt to board a flight out of this judicial district, we will not call you again. We will send a recovery team to locate you, and we will extract the remaining value from your physical person." The line went dead. The sharp click of the disconnected call resonated in Julian's ear. The phone slipped from his slick fingers, tumbling down his chest and hitting the polished hardwood floor. The screen cracked upon impact, a fitting visual for his fractured reality. He was trapped in an inescapable vice. He owed a multi-million-dollar corporate judgment to Apex Financial. He was facing a decade in a federal penitentiary for economic espionage. And now a violent criminal syndicate had placed a 2-hour bounty on his head. The psychological dam broke. The arrogant corporate vice president who spent his entire life mocking my quiet existence finally shattered. Julian dropped to his hands and knees. The tailored charcoal suit, the velvet blazer he wore to project dominance, dragged across the floor, soaking up spilled champagne and dirt. He crawled. He abandoned every shred of his curated dignity and scrambled across the carpet like a terrified animal seeking shelter. He did not crawl toward his parents. They were bankrupt and powerless. He did not crawl toward me. I had just engineered his destruction. He crawled directly toward the elevator bank, targeting the dark windbreakers of the federal agents. He reached the lead investigator. Julian threw his arms forward, his hands grasping the fabric of the agent's tactical trousers. He wept openly, tears streaming down his face, his chest heaving with loud, agonizing sobs. "You have to arrest me!" Julian wailed, his voice a broken, desperate shriek that caused the remaining wealthy patrons to recoil in disgust. "You have to put me in handcuffs right now. Take me to the holding facility. Do not leave me out here. They are going to kill me." You heard the phone call. "They are sending a team to break my legs." I was begging for a steel cage. He viewed the sterile concrete walls of a federal prison as a sanctuary compared to the violent retribution of the Shadow Syndicate. He confessed openly to the fraudulent loan volunteering every detail of his illicit dealings in a frantic bid to secure protective custody. The lead FBI agent looked down at the weeping man clinging to his leg. He did not reach for his handcuffs. He did not offer a reassuring hand or promise a safe extraction. The agent stepped backward, peeling Julian's fingers off his trousers with a look of profound bureaucratic disdain. "Stand up, Mr. Montgomery," the agent ordered, his voice echoing with the cold, unyielding boundaries of federal jurisdiction. Julian remained on his knees, holding his hands up in a posture of total surrender. "Please," he begged, the saliva gathering at the corners of his mouth. "I will tell you everything about the data breach. Just take me with you." "We are the cyber division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation," the agent stated, maintaining his sterile distance. "Our mandate is economic espionage, interstate wire fraud, and digital identity theft. We build complex financial cases. We are not a personal protective detail. We do not provide armed escorts for citizens who borrow money from loan sharks. But they are coming for me," Julian screamed, his voice cracking. "Then I suggest you dial 911 and request a municipal patrol unit." The agent replied, his tone devoid of any sympathy. "You have been served with a federal subpoena. You are mandated to appear in court on Tuesday. Your physical safety prior to that appearance is a local law enforcement matter." The agent turned his back on the ruined executive. He signaled to his team. The 4 federal investigators stepped into the VIP elevator. The heavy brass doors slid shut, sealing the federal shield away from Julian, leaving him entirely exposed to the elements of his own catastrophe. Julian knelt on the hardwood floor of the luxury restaurant. He was surrounded by crystal chandeliers, panoramic city views, and the suffocating weight of total isolation. He looked over his shoulder, seeking a single sympathetic gaze. Thomas and Patricia were staring out the large glass windows, their faces pale and blank. They had signed away their financial autonomy. They were mourning the death of their own elite status. They did not even look at the son groveling on the floor. The patriarchal loyalty was dead. He looked at me. I stood near the table, holding my leather tote bag, observing his breakdown with the detached clinical focus of a scientist watching a parasite wither under a microscope. I offered him nothing. No anger, no pity, no salvation. Julian buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking as he sobbed into the quiet room. The man who introduced me as the failure of our family was now weeping on his knees, begging the universe for a mercy he had never once shown to anyone else. As his cries echoed across the empty space, a new set of footsteps approached from the opposite side of the dining room. The general manager of the Grand Crest Hotel had waited patiently in the shadows while the federal agents conducted their business. He had watched the asset forfeiture. He had witnessed the syndicate phone call. He knew the man crying on the floor possessed no credit, no cash, and no protective cover. The manager stepped forward, the unpaid $20,000 invoice still gripped firmly in his hand. But he did not walk alone. Flanking him were 2 uniformed municipal police officers, their heavy-duty belts jingling faintly as they crossed the dining room. The federal authorities had declined to arrest him for cybercrime tonight, but the local precinct was more than willing to process a felony charge for a stolen luxury dinner. The general manager of the rooftop restaurant stepped forward, cutting through the heavy silence left in the wake of the departing federal agents. He did not possess the tactical authority of the cyber division, but in the rigid hierarchy of high society hospitality, his power was undeniable. He stopped a few feet away from where Julian knelt on the carpet. The 2 municipal police officers flanked him, their hands resting cautiously near the heavy utility belt strapped to their waists. They wore standard dark blue uniforms, projecting the gritty, uncompromising reality of local law enforcement. To them, Julian was not a complex mastermind of economic espionage or a fallen corporate titan. He was merely a well-dressed thief trying to skip an exorbitant tab. The manager looked down at the weeping executive. He held the printed invoice and the stack of declined credit cards in his right hand. He spoke with the crisp, sterile articulation of a man who tolerated 0 disruptions in his establishment. He informed the officers that the individual on the floor had hosted a private liquor tasting event in the penthouse suite the previous week, racking up a $20,000 balance. He presented the string of declined transactions and the frantic attempt to use a frozen family credit card as irrefutable proof of criminal intent. In this jurisdiction, consuming luxury services of that magnitude without the capacity to pay constitutes a felony charge of grand theft. Julian looked up at the local officers, his face smeared with sweat and tears. A bizarre, twisted sense of relief washed over his panicked features. Just moments ago, he was begging the federal investigators to take him into custody to hide him from the shadow syndicate. The municipal holding cell would provide the physical concrete barrier he desperately needed to survive the night. The loan sharks could not break his legs if he was locked inside a county jail. But the relief was instantly crushed by the sheer public humiliation of the process. He was not being escorted away by suited investigators in a discreet federal vehicle. He was being processed like a common criminal in front of the very society he spent his entire life trying to impress. The taller of the two officers stepped forward, his boots heavy against the hardwood floor. He did not issue a polite invitation to step outside or offer to discuss the matter in a private room. He reached down and grabbed Julian by the bicep. His grip was firm and unforgiving, hauling the ruined executive up from the floor with a swift mechanical motion. Julian stumbled, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the champagne-soaked wood. He offered no physical resistance, his body entirely depleted of energy and defiance. The officer twisted Julian's arms behind his back, pressing his wrists together. The sharp metallic click of stainless steel ratcheting over bone echoed through the dining room. The heavy handcuffs bit deeply into his skin, pinning the cuffs of his tailored charcoal suit jacket. The cold weight of the steel locked around his wrists served as the final undeniable anchor to his new reality. The illusion of his boundless tech empire evaporated into the conditioned air. They marched him across the rooftop restaurant. It was a brutal, agonizing procession. The wealthy patrons who had previously cowered against the glass windows during the federal raid now leaned forward in their velvet booths. Their eyes were wide with predatory curiosity. They watched the former vice president of sales paraded past their tables in criminal restraints. The elite ecosystem possesses no memory for past achievements, only a ruthless appetite for a dramatic downfall. Men who had toasted his success a week ago now stared at him with undisguised contempt. Women covered their mouths, whispering harsh judgments as he passed. Julian kept his head bowed, his chin resting heavily against his chest. He could not look at the faces of his peers. He dragged his feet, the sound of his scuffing shoes blending with the ambient noise of the room. The jazz band near the bar tentatively resumed a low, melancholy tune, providing a mocking, elegant soundtrack to his exit. The officers guided him through the heavy brass doors of the public elevator, pushing him inside the steel carriage. The doors slid shut, sealing him away from the luxury world he would never enter again. I remained standing near the corner table, watching the elevator display panel track his descent to the ground floor. The frantic energy of the confrontation slowly bled out of the room, replaced by a cold, settling quiet. I looked down at the velvet booth where my parents remained seated. Thomas and Patricia sat in the exact same positions, frozen like statues in a museum of ancient history. They were profoundly numb, paralyzed by the speed and severity of the execution. The red federal forfeiture notice rested on the glass table, a stark, glaring reminder that their sprawling colonial home was now a locked crime scene. Beside it lay the thick manila folder containing the irrevocable trust agreement they had just signed in tears. They stared at the legal document that now dictated their entire existence. The patriarchal dominance Thomas had wielded for 3 decades was gone, shattered by a single signature. The aristocratic superiority Patricia used to belittle my career and elevate my brother was erased. They were no longer the proud architects of a wealthy suburban dynasty. They were financial dependents. They were wards of the daughter they had marginalized and ignored. Their future was permanently rewritten. They would not return to a sprawling estate with manicured lawns and a heated pool. They would move into a modest, functional apartment chosen by me. They would learn to read price tags at discount grocery stores. They would spend their twilight years living on a strict, unyielding budget subjected to the cold, precise supervision of a cyber forensic expert. The grand legacy of the Montgomery family was reduced to a few sheets of paper inside my leather tote bag. They sat in the dim, amber light, mourning the death of their egos in profound, unbroken silence. I turned my gaze away from the wreckage of my family and looked toward the private VIP exit on the far side of the dining room. Maya had not taken the private elevator down with her legal team. The chief executive officer lingered in the shadows near the mahogany bar, watching the final sequence unfold from a safe distance. She saw the local police drag her treacherous former employee away in steel chains. She saw the toxic family unit neutralized and stripped of their leverage. She witnessed the flawless execution of the trap we designed in the underground speakeasy. A waiter walked past her carrying a silver tray loaded with fresh champagne flutes. Maya reached out and picked up a tall crystal glass. She did not walk back over to my table. She did not need to offer any vocal praise, hollow congratulations, or performative gratitude. She stood tall in her midnight blue suit, her posture radiating undisputed victory. Maya caught my eye across the crowded room. She raised the crystal flute in a slow, deliberate salute. Her dark eyes reflected a deep, silent respect for the tactical slaughter I had just engineered. We were two apex predators who had successfully defended our territory against a parasite. I offered a slight acknowledging nod in return. Maya brought the glass to her lips, took a measured sip of the vintage champagne, and turned toward the exit. She pushed the heavy brass doors open and walked out into the night, her reputation cleared and her financial empire secure. The New Year's Eve dinner concluded in a perfect clinical purge. There was no physical violence required to dismantle my enemies. No voices needed to be raised in anger, and no weapons needed to be drawn. The modern battlefield is not governed by brute force. It is governed by data-leveraged debt and the unforgiving architecture of the law. I stood in the warm, ambient light of the luxury restaurant, listening to the muffled sounds of the city celebrating the approaching midnight hour. The arrogant men who tried to conquer the world through fraud and manipulation were either locked in steel cages or fleeing from violent shadow syndicates. The toxic enablers who worshipped false idols were trapped in a prison of their own poverty. I picked up my heavy leather tote bag, feeling the solid weight of the encrypted server inside, and prepared to step into the new year entirely unreachable by the people who once tried to destroy me. 6 months have passed since the flashing lights of the municipal police cruisers reflected off the glass facade of the Grand Crest Hotel. The bitter December frost has melted away, replaced by the relentless, humid heat of a Chicago summer. I stand on the private balcony of my corner office 40 stories above the financial district. The thick pane of reinforced glass separates me from the roaring wind of the city, offering an unobstructed view of the sprawling urban grid below. I am no longer operating out of a small apartment or sitting in the shadowy corners of suburban dining rooms. The stock price of Apex Financial did not just stabilize after the new year, it skyrocketed. The board of directors realized that a firm capable of catching and dismantling a sophisticated internal data breach in real time was a fortress. Institutional investors poured capital back into the company, rewarding Maya for her decisive leadership and ruthless efficiency. She did not forget the architect of her survival. 2 weeks after the rooftop dinner, Maya walked into my apartment, handed me a pen, and offered me a position that shifted the trajectory of my entire career. I am now the Global Chief Information Security Officer for Apex Financial. I command an entire floor of this towering skyscraper, overseeing a legion of engineers, forensic analysts, and network architects. I build the digital walls that protect billions of dollars in global assets. The executives who once viewed my brother as a rising star now sit in my boardroom waiting for my authorization before launching any new initiative. The view from this balcony stretches for miles, but it cannot reach the concrete perimeter of the Federal Detention Center located 3 hours south of the city limits. Julian is currently confined within those high-security walls. He is not wearing a tailored velvet blazer or checking a heavy designer watch. He wears a standard-issue faded orange jumpsuit. He sleeps on a thin mattress resting on a cold steel slab. His days of maneuvering through VIP lounges and ordering vintage champagne are permanently over-replaced by the rigid, monotonous schedule of the federal penal system. The local grand theft charge kept him behind bars just long enough for the cyber division to secure their grand jury indictments. The digital forensic dossier I compiled was an airtight vault. When his court-appointed public defender reviewed the packet, captures the hard-coded IP addresses and the encrypted logs from the dark web sandbox, he did not even attempt to draft a defense strategy. He sat across from my brother in a sterile interrogation room and told him to plead guilty. Julian is currently awaiting formal sentencing, facing a mandatory minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. He sits in a crowded visitation room on the weekends, staring at the reinforced glass, waiting for an audience that will never arrive. The unregulated shadow syndicate lost their real estate collateral when the government seized the suburban house, and Julian knows the brutal mathematics of the underworld. The moment his federal sentence concludes, those ruthless men will be waiting for him at the prison gates to collect the remaining balance. He is trapped in a permanent state of terror, a captive of his own boundless arrogance. Thomas and Patricia do not visit him. They cannot afford the fuel for the long drive, and they no longer possess the emotional capacity to look at the son who engineered their total ruin. The sprawling colonial estate with the heated pool and the manicured lawn is gone. The federal government auctioned the property to satisfy the sprawling liens Julian attached to their names. My parents now reside in a compact two-bedroom apartment located in a dense, noisy suburb on the outskirts of the city. The physical downgrade is profound. The walls of their new home are paper-thin, vibrating every time a commercial freight train rolls past the nearby transit hub. The air inside smells of damp carpet and generic cleaning solutions. The patriarchal dominance Thomas wielded for decades evaporated the moment he signed the irrevocable trust agreement on that champagne-soaked table. He spends his days sitting in a cheap fabric recliner watching standard broadcast television, his legacy reduced to a bitter memory. He spends hours staring at old photographs of his former country club friends, knowing those men deleted his contact information the morning the federal raid made the local news. Patricia no longer hosts lavish charity galas or wears imported silk blouses. She wears plain cotton sweaters and sensible shoes. She walks to a local discount grocery store, carefully tracking her expenditures on a small yellow notepad. She clips paper coupons, handing them to a bored cashier, praying the total does not exceed the strict weekly allowance I deposit into their restricted debit account. If she tries to purchase a bottle of premium wine or an expensive cosmetic item, the card declines at the register. I dictate their rent, their utilities, and their medical coverage. I receive a digital ledger of their purchases every Friday at noon. They live in a gilded cage built from their own past mistakes. The silence between them is heavy and toxic, filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of their failure. They are suffocating under the profound realization that the daughter they treated as an embarrassing stain on their reputation is now the sole architect of their survival. They learned the hard way that a golden child can tarnish, and the quiet shadow they ignored possessed the power to eclipse their entire world. I step back from the edge of the balcony, the city lights beginning to flicker to life as the sun dips below the horizon. The journey from a dismissed sibling to an untouchable executive forged a sharp, undeniable clarity in my mind. Your intrinsic value is never determined by the twisted judgment or the contempt of toxic individuals, even if those individuals share your bloodline. You are never obligated to shrink your potential, hide your intellect, or sacrifice your own peace to serve the fragile egos of arrogant people. Society often demands endless forgiveness for abusive relatives under the guise of familial duty. But loyalty without mutual respect is just a mechanism for exploitation. Blood does not grant anyone a license to destroy your mental health or drain your resources. True power is not found in screaming matches, frantic apologies, or desperate public arguments. True power is the ability to observe the chaos in total silence, to calculate your countermeasures with surgical precision, and to step out of the way so the relentless greed of your enemies can dig their own graves. You do not have to set yourself on fire to keep toxic people warm. Have you ever been pushed to the absolute breaking point by entitled relatives only to use your own quiet brilliance to dismantle their toxic reign? How did you construct your own boundaries and reclaim your power from the people who tried to diminish you? Share your victories and your strategies in the comments below. If my journey to untouchable freedom resonated with your own struggles, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and join our growing community here at Me Revenge. Never apologize for choosing your own peace, and never fund the illusion of a fraud. I will see you in the next video.